Our guest joining us in the studio, we see him about once a month, is Chris Anderson from the Herrett Center at the College of Southern Idaho, and we'd like to welcome him back.
Thank you.
Good to see you, and of course, you probably pedaled in under some very threatening clouds.
Yeah, I didn't actually get rained on, but I still have to go back to work. So
Two showers in one day. 924, 70 right now. Bill Colley with you as well on News Radio 1310, KLIX and newsradio1310.com. This is a real fun season, I'm sure, at the planetarium because, number one, the kids are out of school.
Yep.
And so you're going to be seeing a lot of them through the summer. But right off the top, you wanted to talk about an art exhibit by Keith Farnsworth. That's at the Hall of Friends, and that's going to be running through, well, almost a good 2 months.
Yeah, and for those who aren't familiar with Keith's work, um, I it almost defies description. It's a combination of sort of whimsical and whimsical in the Tim Burton sense, if that gets across what I'm. There's parts of it that are slightly disturbing, but amusing at the same time. You just really have to see it. And the neat thing about it is, he has his art for sale, and it's incredibly inexpensive. So if you want to get some really funky, I mean, it's incredibly well executed too, and it's fun. Some of them are a little, like I say, a little disturbing at times. But yeah, if that's your thing, I mean, it's.
It's like the old Addams Family cartoons before there was the TV show and movies.
It's kind of in that neck of the woods. Yeah, like I say, although maybe more Tim Burton-esque in the fact that it's kind of phantasmagorical, I guess would be the best word I could come up with for it. So it's very very. It's like fantasy sort of stuff. It's not reality, but you just got to see it.
People, I think that even people who live here, a lot of them they think of the museum and they think, well, okay, there's an occasional display and then there's the planetarium, but they don't realize just the big reach that the museum has.
Well, right, and when you ask people what the Herrett Center is, probably the first thing you'll think about, like you said, is either the planetarium or the anthropology exhibits. But of course, we're also an art museum. We've got our art gallery, but we also have other spaces within the museum where we can display art. And in fact, that bears mentioning. Of course, we all know that LeVar Steele, longtime CSI art professor, passed away last week, and we've got some of his works that are in our collection there. We've got our own collection that's stored there at the museum and for CSI, and so some of his works will be on display very shortly here as well, so you'll get a chance to see some of his stuff. And then, of course, completely independent of both of those, the art gallery itself has its own exhibit, and that's Wilma Lucille Rudine in the King Gallery, and that'll go through September 3rd. So really, lots of art, lots of different types of art that you can come see at the museum.
And then on it's Saturday, June 11th, and that's actually this coming Saturday.
It is this coming Saturday. Yep, second Saturday. And if you've been hearing it on the news that Mars is close, well, yes, it was closest than it's been for almost 11 years at the end of last month. But that doesn't mean that it's now rushed away from us. It's still fairly close. And a couple of us were up at Hagerman Fossil Beds over the weekend. We got to do an annual star party up there. And it was just amazing. I mean, the skies weren't perfectly clear, but clear isn't the whole game. I mean, as long as you've got, enough clarity, what really matters is what we call seeing, which is really how stable the air is. And it was so stable. So images were so crisp. Stars were little pinpoints. On Mars, you could see there's sort of a ring of dark dunes that kind of rings the northern polar cap of Mars, and that was very distinct.
Was this in the eastern sky?
Well, Mars is in the southeast right now in the early evening. Yeah, I mean, it's really bright orange color. You can't miss it. So
Saturday morning, I drove here to the studios at about a little after 6 o'clock. I had to drop something off. Turned down Park Avenue from Washington, so I guess I'm facing more of a southeasterly direction. And there was something very bright in the horizon.
Well, so in the early morning, that wouldn't be Mars, because Mars will be way over in the west by that time.
Okay.
So, yeah, I'm not sure what you'd be seeing there. Probably a star. My first question would be, was it twinkling? Because if it's twinkling, it's a star. If it's not twinkling, it's probably a planet. So
I thought at first it might be, an airliner, and then it didn't move.
yeah, well, it could be a bright star. I'm trying to think of what stars are over in the eastern sky in the morning right now. I do most of my stargazing at night.
Then it may well have been just an object that was flying, and I just, because of the distance, it may look like it's stationary.
Yeah, it's a little too early for Sirius, the brightest star, to be up in the early morning sky. That'll be a couple months before it starts making its way in there. But Yeah, I'm not sure what you would have seen there. So,
It could have been an unidentified flying object, but I won't go that far out on
well, I
the.
mean, if you couldn't tell what it was unidentified,
Yes,
and if it was in the sky, you could say it's flying. So,
but that's a
by
lack of
definition, it's a UFO. So,
that's a lack of personal skill from the observer. It's not necessarily unidentified. Somebody who actually knows what they're looking at would go, "Aha! I'll tell you what that is." Well, we have to take a short break, but we've got more coming up. We'll talk a little bit more about the Star Party, and then, of course, some of the primitive skills classes that are coming up. Also, I wanted to ask you before we wrap up the program today, if we get a chance before the end of the show, a big story came out this morning that there's a private group that wants to do a moon landing, and maybe we can chat a little bit about that.
Great.
Out of Florida, actually, I think a lot of them are probably old NASA folks who are now working with this private group, and they've got some great ideas about what they'd like to do. But we'll talk about that perhaps coming up in a few minutes. We want to mention Chris Anderson is joining us this morning. We're at 70. It's 9:30. Bill Colley with you as well on News Radio 1310, KLIX, and News Radio 1310.com. Our guest is joining us this morning. He's talking a little bit about some of the events going on at the Herrett Center at the College of Southern Idaho. Chris Anderson comes in on a monthly basis and sits in with us on News Radio 1310 KLIX and News Radio 1310.com. The story is Top Story with Bill Colley. Second Saturday Star Parties. Now, this time of year, this is easier to do because you don't have to wear a parka.
Yes. On the other hand, it's also gets a pretty late start because the sun isn't down until quite late. Now, the good news is, normally our June star party, since the summer solstice is in June, that's about as late as we're ever going to start. But because we've got bright planets in the early evening sky, we can actually start looking at those even before the sky is completely dark. And in fact, in many ways, it's better to look at them in twilight because you don't get as much glare. If you've been watching the sky at all lately, you've noticed that Jupiter is really bright, Mars is really bright. Well, in a dark sky, looking through a telescope, all you're doing is making it brighter, and so often that can make it harder to see some of the detail. But in twilight, some of the best views I've had of Mars have been in twilight. So we're starting in twilight this Saturday at 9:30. So
I'm sure a lot of people would like to take part in one of these things, but I don't think I've ever asked you, do they need to make a reservation in advance?
not at all. In fact, we're open from 9:30 till midnight. You can come for whatever time you want. You can show up at 9:30. You can show up at 10:40. You can show up at 11:17. It's totally up to you. I do typically tell people that if you want shorter lines, come later. It does mean you'll miss some of the early targets that'll be setting earlier in the evening, but typically the lines are long at the beginning of the night, and then by the end of the night, it's not at all uncommon to only have like two or three people up there that are more or less getting a private showing it through the big telescope, so you can get a lot more targets that way.
For people, I think, too, who really would like more details on, getting involved with so many of these events, simply going to the web. I mean, going to your website is probably the easiest way to do that and to get that whole rundown.
Sure, and another thing to consider is that second Saturday is also the night that our local astronomy club meets at the museum at 7 o'clock. So you can make a whole evening of it, and they welcome anyone with an interest in astronomy. You don't have to own a telescope. If you have a telescope and you're not sure how to use it, they're very helpful that way too. So yeah, just show up at 7 o'clock. There's no charge for it, and you kind of find out what the club's all about. And then by the time they're wrapping up is about when we'll start to get things going up in the observatory, and like I say, we'll go till midnight. So as long as we get good clear skies.
I did a lot of driving over the weekend through a lot of sagebrush, and while I was doing that, I was thinking how nice it would be sometime to maybe go pitch a tent and camp out in the desert in this area. And you have some skills classes coming up because people who might want to do that more than one night might want to consider taking advantage of some of this.
Oh, sure. And if you're a fan of these shows where people go out into the wild and have to fend for themselves, this is right
Below
in that.
Zero being my favorite.
Yeah, there you go. And then of course, Man Against or what man? I'm trying to remember some of the names.
Is it Wilderness?
Something wild, and yeah, there's Bear Grylls, and there's Les Stroud, and all these guys that go out and show you how to fend for yourself with very few things. Well, that's really what the first of our primitive skills classes is all about. If you ever want to learn how to flint knap, this is an opportunity to do that. So there's actually three classes. You're there for all three. So in other words, this isn't three separate classes. This is three sessions of the same class. It's going to be June 14th, 17th, and 18th. And by the time you're done, you'll learn how to do the basics of flint knapping. You basically be shown how to make your own flint knapping toolkit, the sort of things you need to pressure flake and produce the basic stone tools. And it's a lot of fun. It's something I haven't actually done myself, but something I'd like to one of these days. So
And once you can recognize what flint looks like. I mean, it's pretty common when you're out in the desert.
Right, and to be honest, flint knapping is kind of a generic term. I think for the most part they'll be probably using obsidian. Obsidian is actually a lot easier to knap than flint is. Flint is a really tough type of stone, so you have to really whack it hard to get the results. Whereas obsidian is glass, and it's broken about as easily as glass is. And so if you know how to do it properly, you can produce stone tools with considerably less effort than flint. So.
Of course, in our modern age, everyone's looking for less effort. That's why we all have what they used to call radar ranges in our homes and things like that. You also have summer workshops for kids, and obviously, these things. There are so many children in the area that parents are thinking, "How can I keep them busy?"
Oh yeah, now
This
that
is
they're
what
out of
it's set up
school, I
for.
mean, probably the parents are already into, gee, my kids have been out of school for a week. What can I do with them? They're driving me nuts. But yeah, we do these various classes through the summer. We've got them really going all summer long. But I'll just tell you about the June classes. Frankly, these are getting really close to full at this point. So if you think might want to get out on these, you're not going to want to wait very much longer. But we've got one on making paper airplanes, and that's going to be on June 15th. We've got one on coiled pottery, so the coiled style of making pots on June 22nd, and you can make your own hoop drum, like a Native American style drum, on June 29th. And I'll come back and tell you next month about the ones coming up for July. So
There have been some stories. I remember probably 30 years ago seeing a story on TV about a young man. He and his father were just working on paper airplanes, and they came up with a design just almost by accident, or really by accident, and this thing would just soar and soar and soar.
well, and I'll be honest, I was helping out Laura Borwarni, who's our educator that does these programs, and because she knows I dabble in origami a little bit, and she says, well, do you have any good paper airplane folds? And I got to looking, and they couldn't really find anything in my books that I thought was great, so I did some googling, and sure enough, I found the world record. Paper airplane flight over 200 feet. They did it
Wow.
inside an airplane hangar, and it's amazing if you watch the video. This thing goes almost all the way up to the ceiling, almost vertically, and then comes diving down and just skims above the floor for a long distance before it finally drops. And of course, the people doing it all whooping and hollering. Well, that's one of the folds that I managed to find for Laura. So maybe the kids will get a chance to actually make their own world record style of paper airplane.
And at the end of that flight, Dr. Zayas grabbed the plane and crumpled it up. We've got more with Chris Anderson from the Herrett Center on the way, 20 minutes from 10 o'clock. Chris Anderson is in studio with us from the Herrett Center at the College of Southern Idaho. It's 9:43 and it's 70. Bill Colley with you as well on Top Story on News Radio 1310 KLIX and newsradio1310.com. And I know someone was looking to get in touch with us by telephone. We have a little bit of running room here in this final segment, so we might be able to take a telephone call or two as well, 736-0300. But he has one other item that he needs to mention, and Chris, that is, this is something that's critical, making money.
That's right. Well, you can pretty much count on whenever there's a major holiday that we're going to have a sale in our store, and Father's Day is no exception. So if you're looking for Father's Day gifts, you should come check it out. So basically, that'll run next week, all week, up until Saturday, and of course we're closed on Sundays, which is Father's Day. So don't wait till Sunday. Don't wait till Father's Day to get your Father's Day gift if you want to come in. But we do discount just about everything in the store. The only exceptions being the Meade telescopes, because we don't mark those up enough to be able to discount them. So
But there's one thing we can say about this. People think about, Father's Day, getting a tie, and or as my daughter would just go, she'd find me some unique coffee cups, but it was usually a coffee cup or
yeah,
something along those lines. If you're looking for something that's the unexpected,
absolutely. And
this is the place.
and there's a lot of good stuff at the museum store that can help dad get in touch with his inner kid. I mean, there's just, fun science type toys that you don't have to be a kid to enjoy. There's just kind of some cool things there. So I would recommend those. And I also got to realizing, Bill, that the first Monday of July is Independence Day. So I won't be here on the 4th of July. I don't know if you will or not, but
Unlikely, but we might have to do this on a Friday or the following,
right.
sometime in that
Well,
week.
and then I also got to realizing, because of that, that'll be after the Pomerel Star Party that we do every year. So I do need to tell folks, Pomerel is scheduled for July 2nd, Saturday, July 2nd. They are doing construction up on the mountain right now, and I just did speak to Jody Burrows, who runs the operation up there. We're going to make sure it happens. So we may have to do things, do a little logistical rearranging, but we're still going to have the Pomerel Star Party on July 2nd. So for those who are wondering, going, oh, I've heard there's construction up there. Is it? And a lot of their summer activities are shut down. Is it still going to happen? Yes, it is going to happen. So, and as we get closer, I will probably do a phone in with you and let you know,
Sure.
or maybe even we could do that Friday the 1st if that's possible. That way we'd have be able the absolute latest information about what's going to happen. So
And that probably would be fine, although we'll kind of crimp Dominion Day a little bit if we do
okay,
that. Although I don't know that there are that many Canadians
yeah,
listening at this point. But they're responsible for the Aurora Borealis, so I guess we could say that they might be tuning in.
all right.
Hey, we were talking off air, and there's a story that, well, the two of us don't really have a lot of background on, so we're not going to go into a lot of detail about it, but there's a private company that wants to launch what's really, I guess, a probe to the moon and just land some equipment up there and do some research, but it might be opening the door to a great deal more in the way of returning to the moon with exploration. I don't know about manned exploration, but we're seeing a change here in the approach. The government said they've approved this. We're going to be seeing more and more private companies getting involved, and maybe that's a good thing.
Well, and don't forget also the Google Lunar X Prize is still going. That competition is still going, and they have extended the deadline. But I believe they're now talking about sending whichever competitors are going to try to win the Google Lunar X Prize up at the end of this year. So there's another private launch of hardware to the moon. And in the case of the Google Lunar X Prize, they actually have to land on the moon and then actually have a part of the vehicle or the vehicle itself that travels, I think it's 500 meters on the surface and sends back data. And if they do, then they win the prize. And the prize it's a cash prize. It's the biggest one that Google's ever put forth for technology. In fact, I think it's the biggest technology prize that's ever been offered. It's still a small fraction of what the teams are going to spend to do it. So this is much more of a prestige thing than it is a cash thing that they're going after. But as far as I know, there's at least one team that has booked a launch vehicle. So I think it could actually happen this year. We'll get to see the Google Lunar X Prize, whether they make it or not. So
And having a launch vehicle. Now, the government approves this, and I was thinking as I was reading this story this morning about this group out of Cape Canaveral. The reason you need anybody I could imagine could launch their own probe, but you've got to have some space to do that. And because of
sure.
safety and environmental concerns, the government steps in and says, "What's your plan?" And then they review it, and then they make a decision.
Sure. Well, and there's really two reasons why our major launch facility is in Florida. One is because being closer to the equator, you get more of a fling from Earth's rotation. But two, if your rocket goes off course, it's easier to drop it in the ocean than in someone's backyard. So that's a big incentive towards having launches from the East Coast, because your rockets tend to go off east over the ocean, where if they fall out of the sky, they're not going to hurt anybody. So
Well, let's just say that too. You had someone who was living in, I don't know, Buell or somewhere, and they wanted to have a rocket launch, and they had some land. They figured I could do this. You still have to clear space because there are planes using it, and
absolutely.
so you've got to make sure, and that's hypothetical. I don't think anybody in Buell is planning that anytime soon.
Well, now you say that, Bill, but just not long before you came to Idaho, there was talk of putting a launch facility in Idaho, and they were talking about doing it possibly up at INL. So yeah, it's not a completely ridiculous idea, and the idea here being. If you're up relatively far north, no, you don't get that fling from Earth's rotation, but it makes it easier to put spacecraft into a high inclination orbit, one that is not near the equator. Because some vehicles, some satellites you want near the equator, but others it's desirable to have them in a higher inclination orbit. Typically, a lot of the spy satellites are in high inclination orbits because that way they can cover more of the globe. So, back in the day, back in like the 70s, whenever as amateur astronomers out looking at the sky, when you saw a satellite that was moving in an orbit that looked like it was almost north-south, pretty good chance it's probably a spy satellite. So
Wave as it goes
exactly.
over. I have a friend. He was on the air with me on Friday, and we were talking off air. I mentioned he was with the Thunderbirds at one point in his Air Force
Right.
career, and he lives along the East Coast now. And he says that when they're out walking the boardwalk in Rehoboth Beach, Delaware, they can see drones flying over because they patrol the coasts. And I said, "Well, are they looking for you, Colonel?" He says, "If they are," he says, "I've been giving them the one-fingered salute." But he actually lives quite close to Wallops Island,
Oh,
where
sure.
And when I lived in that area, it used to be during nighttime launches, I would be able to sit on the deck. But these are much smaller rockets that are going off from locations
Sure.
like Wallops Island, Virginia.
Sure. Yep.
They're
Yep.
not anything really large.
Yeah, and I don't think anyone is proposing that the launch facility in Idaho would be for manned launches. I think they're strictly talking for, small satellite type things.
Well, we're nearly 50 years since man walked on the moon, and I think that we all who grew up in that era figured we'd be doing these things routinely, and then of course it didn't happen after the end of the Cold War.
Yep. Yep.
But there is and maybe even sending men back into to space is probably not as realistic as it used to be for
Well,
exploration.
yeah, but consider, I mean, our knowledge of materials has gotten so much better. We can make vehicles that are much lighter, and when it comes to launching, the cost of launch, it's all about keeping the weight down. There's a cost per pound, and of course, you've been watching the news. This inflatable module they just put on board the space station.
Hmm.
Huge advantage there being that it's a lot less weight for the volume that it occupies, and so that could be the wave of the future we're seeing right there, is these sort of inflatable spacecraft. And so yeah, it's all about keeping the weight down, and now that we have these much more advanced materials than existed back in the 60s and 70s, I think we can do it cheaper than we could back then.
And we were having an off-air conversation about Elon Musk, who's the man really behind a lot of our scientific innovations or proposals, and he's got the money to do it, and that he has been proposing sending people to Mars. The one drawback, as I understand it, about prolonged travel in space is still that there are certain rays that will pass through not only the machinery, but they'll pass through the helmets or the heads,
Yep.
and eventually somebody will end up with a spongiform illness because of the brain being riddled by these
Or at the
things.
very least, cancer. Yeah, I mean, because you're being pelted by these high speed particles, and even our astronauts in space around the Earth, they're still protected by Earth's magnetosphere, which is the magnetic field that traps these particles. But once you're beyond the Earth, you're totally exposed to that stuff. And people have talked about ways to mitigate that. And one way to do is shield the vehicle. Again, shielding is weight. Weight is expensive, so yep, that brings your cost up. But people have talked about, well, water is actually a pretty good shield. So you basically make your spacecraft a water balloon with a hollow inside where the astronauts are, and they're surrounded by water all the time, or possibly their water and their food and their waste. And it's all acts as a pretty good shield. So, but you're right, it's not a perfect shield. And if you spend the better part of 2 years in space to get to Mars and back again, which is what it would take with our current propulsion technology, you've got some health issues on your hands for sure. So.
A lot of people would do it, though. I'm still sure, though,
Oh,
because
absolutely. Yeah.
being first would be
You
the
bet.
challenge.
Yeah.
We have a caller with us. Caller, you're on the air with Chris Anderson at 9:53.
Oh, good morning, Mr. Henderson. Hey, two things I wanted to ask you. One of them, did you hear about the sword they found on Tutankhamun's crypt? That they said it was from outer space. Could you tell us what kind of metal it was or something like that of the sword?
I'm sorry,
And also,
you're breaking up just a little bit. Could you repeat? I didn't hear exactly what you said was found.
they found a sword, kind of like the
Oh, yeah,
mythical
yeah, yeah.
sword.
Yeah, yeah. This,
Yeah.
yeah.
Could you tell us about it? And also, all the time I listen to this commercial about naming the stars after somebody. I think that's the biggest scam ever. I
Well,
mean, that's just the same as a pit Ross, ain't it?
Well, okay. So let me start with the first one. So yes, the dagger that they're talking about was found in the tomb of King
King
Tut.
Tut, yeah.
Yep. And what they determined was that it was forged from meteoric iron. So probably the Egyptians found an iron meteorite on the ground. And keep in mind that this would have been, before, this is the Bronze Age. This is before the Iron Age. And so iron was not something that was readily available to them. So here's this, from the heavens, a gift of iron. And so they decided to use that iron to create this dagger. So it didn't arrive on Earth in finished form. They had to do some work on the iron to make it into the dagger. But yeah, they were able to do non-destructive testing to determine that the mix of chemicals within it are exactly what you'd expect from a iron from space, as opposed to iron ore that you'd find here on the Earth. So that's the story there. As far as the star naming, you're absolutely right. There's no legitimacy to those star naming companies. There's nothing official about it whatsoever. In fact, early on, with at least one of these star naming companies, early on they actually were supposedly naming real stars, but they sold so many of these that they eventually ran out of stars that were fairly bright. And I've seen people who've brought to me at the observatory saying, "Oh, I'd like to see my star," and they'll bring me the star chart, and you can tell that the star that they supposedly had named after them, someone had taken a felt tip marker and just put a dot on the star map. And how do you prove that there's no star in that direction if you're willing to look with a big enough telescope? Well, I can't prove. I would never be able to disprove that. But yeah, I mean, in some cases, there's even a question whether the so-called star being named even really exists. So yeah, I take those with a really big grain of salt because they're certainly not official in any sense.
I want to thank him for the call. I had a friend one time, and he came back from Europe with a little chunk of the Berlin Wall, and I said, "Well, it's very nice, but what else could you do with it? It's just a piece of concrete." But it was in a bag, sealed and labeled. And
oh, sure.
And
I've argued for years that what we ought to do is start selling little vials of official dirt from Evel Knievel's ramp, and have them numbered. And it's like, because there's biker dudes from here to Sturgis who'd pay to get a little vial of official Evel Knievel ramp dirt, right, from his famous attempt to jump
private property, and so that means somebody living there still to this day could likely take that project on.
That's what I'm saying. Hey, you don't have to sell the whole ramp. You want to keep it exclusive enough that they have some value to them. But yeah, why not? How cool would that be? I know there was some bikers that think, dude, I have some actual ramp from Evel Knievel's ramp. So
got about 30 seconds. Again, for the people who'd like to follow some of the schedules, the website again is.
Oh, that would be herrett.csi.edu. Herrett has 2 R's and 2 T's. You can also follow us on Facebook. You can call our information line at 732-6655. If you're looking specifically for information about the observatory, which, by the way, I forgot to mention, we're now in summer solar session season. So every Wednesday afternoon, we've got our solar telescope set up from 1:30 to 3:30 for free viewing. But if you want to know what's going on with the observatory, that's 732 Moon. And for that matter, you can also... like I say, follow us on Facebook. But the information line with 732 Moon, that'll also tell you which planets are which when you're looking in the sky too. So
we'll see you in a few weeks. We're not quite sure what day yet, but we'll see Chris again.
Tentatively July 1st, but we'll see if that works out. So
it's coming up on 9:58, and of course, news is on the way from Fox. Just a quick note: Rush Limbaugh is on vacation this week. Buck Sexton is filling in some of these days. I'm not sure which ones. I talked to him over the weekend in Nampa at the Republican convention, and I don't think we got it nailed down. And he may be in all week, but generally that doesn't work that way. But he just asked me, he said, "Promise me you'll leave me a big audience." So don't go away. Stick around. That's coming up in just a few minutes. God willing, the creek don't rise. I'll be back here tomorrow morning between 8 and 10 o'clock on News Radio 1310 KLIX and NewsRadio1310.com.